Stranger of Paradise initially came off as quite strange to me. I remember seeing some gameplay trailers around its release, but I wasn't sold on those for some reason that is now completely lost to me. That is, until I got it on a Steam sale on top of the 20 buck base discount after it was ported to PC in the first place, with the original PlayStation launch base price being 60 and the base Steam price being 40. Just that alone, slashing the price because the game had been out for a while, is great. And I think would be even greater to implement this across more titles across the entire gaming landscape, as it is genuinely a great way to pull in more people that might have been hesitant to pick up a game at full price, even multiple years after its initial launch, which some games still do, of course. Anyways, I bought the game to try it out, and what they do is they give you the game, and I was pleasantly surprised and overwhelmed by the adventure that lay before me.
The time to cast off the veil of darkness and bring the world once more into light.
What makes a man? What part of a person is it that determines who you are? Memories. We are nothing if not our memories. Yet these memories are not just imprinted onto our mind, but also onto our very soul in the form of a personality and even onto the world itself through our actions and impact on others. So, what would happen if a stranger of paradise starts regaining his memories of paradise and realizes the power he has can change that world itself? The story starts out at the point that would traditionally be towards the ending of a classic RPG. You already went through everything a regular RPG protagonist would go through, already met all the townspeople, proven yourself to the king, etc. And the first actual mission you go on should be the final boss. As it turns out though, nothing is quite as easy as it seems. You are here to kill chaos, of course, but chaos is more than just a bad guy on a dark throne in an evil castle. And even after trying to go after the servants of chaos, the elemental fiends, to free the crystals from their grip, the people don't love you for it. They actually start hating you for it, as their world is now changing in ways they don't like and don't recognize, and they need someone to blame for it. Someone to become chaos. While I would love to dive deeper into the story, as it is genuinely a lot more interesting than I first gave it credit for, I am simply not allowed to. There's a disclaimer here that doesn't allow for some stuff to be shown and recorded, so I won't tempt fate by doing this, and I'll just keep it surface level when it comes to the story. The story here is essentially a meta-level retelling / recontextualization of the original story of the very first Final Fantasy game. Reading the wiki plot synopsis of Final Fantasy I makes a lot clearer though, especially after finishing the main story of Stranger of Paradise. Let's just say the origin part in Final Fantasy Origin is quite accurate. The levels you go through are practically all inspired by other Final Fantasy titles, which is made clear as day by the loading screen text for these levels. The Pravaka Sea Grot is Sastasha from Final Fantasy XIV, the Fiend of Water's hideout is straight out of Midgar from Final Fantasy VII. This, of course, begs the question as to why this world is made this way, what the goal is behind it all. Who is actually doing this and for what purpose? These are, perhaps surprisingly, all questions that get clear answers by the end of the main story. In short, the story here definitely feels like a Final Fantasy story. It obviously becomes more complex than just, I want to kill chaos. That much is a given, is to be expected, but it did take some cool turns I didn't quite expect. If you pay attention and find some text logs of the beaten path throughout the levels, you can piece together stuff a lot faster for yourself than the game does it for you as well, which is always pretty neat in any game. Jack, the protagonist, is also just a fun character and has some great moments and one-liners, and the chemistry between the different characters is also pretty good, I think. Jack is the ultimate autist, purely driven by a single goal, and he doesn't take shit from anyone.
I don't give a fuck who you are.
The DLC stories then essentially keep building on the main story after it's finished and function as epilogues and introduce some well-known characters from the greater Final Fantasy universe like Gilgamesh and Bahamut. Here as well, the story keeps being interesting enough to go through the increasing challenges these DLC provide, and the last DLC especially is a very satisfying conclusion to the game as a whole. So I will refrain from expanding any further on the story itself, mainly because of that disclaimer, but I will mention some stuff here and there where it's relevant to gameplay and the like, but I won't do a play-by-play or analysis or give any deeper opinions on the themes and such, which is usually something I try to do when looking at a game's story more in depth. But to keep my opinion on it as short as possible, I liked it, it was interesting, it was cool. Jack is based as fuck. That is all. Visually and performance-wise, the game did have some moments where the frames dipped substantially or where the game just looked worse. Both of these mainly occurred in the more lit up and open levels you go through. The forest with the changing weather, especially when it's sunny, the flesh hell area, etc. Textures and stuff definitely don't make it look like a game that's only 3 years old either, by the way, but I'm more and more tempted to forego performance and visual issues I'm having the more modern a game is, as long as I still have my old hardware, which I should be upgrading by the end of the year. Gameplay-wise, these frame drops didn't have any real impact, thankfully, as the combat kept feeling about as responsive as it did without those frame drops. I've never had a moment where I felt I died because the game stuttered or anything, which is really all that matters. Sounds are good and recognizable, with a lot of audio stings for combat related stuff that's going on. Not literally everything during combat has its own unique audio sting or anything, but the important stuff does, like an unblockable attack being fired off, or enemies going broken and being ready for a soul burst, so the audio does add a lot here. Combat feels and sounds very meaty and visceral, which is great. Soul bursts, aka executions, have a great amount of flair to them as well, being a unique animation per enemy type and always sounding and looking very satisfying, which is welcome as you do these soul bursts very often throughout the game. Music is also very nice to listen to here, as it is very much a Final Fantasy soundtrack, of course. It reincorporates a lot of the older titles' themes, if I'm not mistaken, which fits in with the setting as a whole, of course, and it's just good music. There are some really amazing tracks here, with perhaps the first phase Black Knight theme being my favorite. Gameplay-wise then, the game looks a lot more complicated at the start than it actually feels to play once you get into it. But it still has a lot of complexity to it you can engage with at your own leisure. It throws a lot of new stuff at you at the start, with just the first mission alone giving you 7 new jobs to play with, and the majority of the game's systems, like combo abilities, gear stats and the like. In essence, the game itself is quite simple. You go on a mission, which drops you into a level you can explore, with some side paths and secrets here and there, with a clear goal to reach at the end of it. For main story missions, this is always defeating a boss, while for side missions, these goals are generally more varied, like killing a number of specific enemies instead. Fighting enemies awards you with experience and loot, obviously, and especially at the start of the game, this will result in a lot of levels for a lot of jobs and a lot of gear, which you don't really know what to do with yet. When it comes to gear, there is a lot of that here. Like, just the raw volume of gear you can obtain is insane. Reminds me of a game like Diablo or Path of Exile. Gear drops are, to my best knowledge at least, completely random, though the overall quality is influenced by difficulty and mission level. You won't get an artifact dropped at level 1 on easy, but you'll probably get 10 plus artifacts dropped in a Lufenia difficulty, Dragon Trial boosted level 500 mission. It makes sense in that way. There are two minor issues though I had with the gear system when starting out, but both of these issues have essentially fixed themselves or dissipated over time. Firstly, the sheer amount and variety of gear, weapons and the jobs tied to all of it is just plain overwhelming. Just after the first mission, you essentially unlock a job for every weapon type, except the axe I guess, each having their own affinity bonuses, combo abilities, job tree, playstyle, the list goes on. You can equip 2 jobs at once and switch between those, which helps, getting used to 2 of them at the same time, but to keep up with the amount of variety of gear that drops here is difficult. The solution to this? Don't really bother with it for the most part. Try out the weapons that look fun in the tutorial area and then pick jobs that allow those weapons to be used. Then just press the optimize gear button every so often, so your item level doesn't fall behind too much, and you'll clear the majority of the main story with no real issues, even on hard difficulty. The second issue with the gear system essentially flows from the first. The management of this overwhelming amount of loot can be tedious, and keeping up a build isn't easy. This is for the simple reason that the optimize gear button just equips the highest item level gear, not the strongest gear per se. A lower level artifact gear piece will usually be a lot stronger than a higher level rarity 1 gear piece. There are ways to help manage this in-game though. You have presets you can set to go back to, so even if you become weaker after optimizing your gear, you can just go back to that previous build preset. Then you can also lock gear pieces in place. Say you have a very cool and powerful weapon equipped you never want to unequip automatically, you just lock it in place and it never will be. This is something I only realized quite late for myself though and haven't really used. And you can of course also set filters for auto dismantling, as well as filters in your inventory itself if you're looking for something specific. In the end, you can just manually sift through new gear pieces and equip what seems better, but this can be time consuming to do every 5 minutes you open a treasure chest or defeat some loot piñata enemies like cactuars. In any case, like I said, these are minor issues, or I guess you could even say growing pains as you step into the game, as the game as a whole is quite deep and complex when it comes to systems and customizability, even allowing you to completely break the game with some insanely powerful builds, especially once you start getting into the DLC stuff. Starting with artifact gear and continuing with relic gear, you can have 2 affinities on 1 piece of gear at the same time, giving you a ton of affinity bonuses to stack on top of each other, which then, combined with powerful affixes, is what makes builds so powerful. But enough talking about just the gear, let's take a look at combat instead, which is of course intertwined with the gearing system itself. In true Final Fantasy fashion, you have a ton of different jobs to pick from to go beat your enemies to death with. At the start of the game, these are all related to their own weapon. Swordsman for the greatsword, mage for the mace, lancer for the polearm, duelist for the daggers, and so on. Your choice of a weapon is the biggest variable in how combat plays out, because they determine your basic moveset. Daggers are very quick and agile, allowing you to move while attacking. The axe is slow and allows each attack to be charged, but is very immobile. Knuckles allow for a barrage of continuous attacks with its own prowess system that allows for big finishing moves and the like, as long as you don't get hit. Each weapon feels very unique like this, and of course has its own strengths and weaknesses to play into. The basic jobs all play into each weapon's strengths, giving you relevant stat upgrades as you go down the job tree, as well as combo abilities for that specific weapon. Every move of every weapon has a combo ability spot related to it, and each of these can be a wide variety of unlockable combo moves, as well as weapon abilities. These are your most damaging moves, both for HP and break damage, but do cost MP to pull off. And this is where the main combat loop comes in. MP management. MP is what combat is all about, both building it up and spending it. To quickly sketch how this works, you start any mission with 2 bars of max MP, but you can go up to 6. You increase this max MP by parrying enemies with your soul shield or executing them with a soul burst. You replenish MP itself mainly by attacking enemies with your normal attacks, though there's a lot of other ways to do this depending on what build you're going for. So what this means in actual combat is you attack enemies with your weapon until you have enough MP to spend on abilities which deal a lot of damage or help to buff or support you in some way, which then makes it easier to build up MP even more. Offensively, this means you have a lot of options to keep on the pressure. With a ton of abilities you can customize where exactly in your combos they appear, and even make their MP costs cheaper through your build, so you can really keep on hitting the enemy constantly. Defensively then, you also have a bunch of options. You have a regular block, which becomes a parry if timed correctly, which is best against physical attacks, as magical attacks will still deal some damage when blocked. A regular parry also helps you in restoring your break faster, so it's worth it to try and get a few parries in here and there just to keep up your break. Break is just a measure of poise or stance or however you want to call it. If your break gauge depletes fully, you are broken and have to recover, which depending on whatever enemy or boss has broken you, usually results in a quick death following that break quite closely. Enemies also have their own break gauge, which is what you need to get down to be able to soul burst them in the first place, so break damage is usually the main way to go. And it is also what your abilities excel at. You can also spend your own break gauge by using your soul shield, which you can use to parry almost every single attack completely, and usually staggers the enemy on top of it as well. This, plus the MP you build up through a soul shield parry, makes a soul shield parry the obvious king of defensive options if you time it correctly without expending all your break gauge, that is, as it leaves you open to a lot of break damage and being broken. Then there's also a dodge, which is quite fast, and you can do that twice in a row for a dodge roll to cover some more ground. All of these options are all without even considering command abilities, which is a collection of special moves, of which each job gives you one to unlock. These can be used by any job and have very wide and special use cases. There's Blood Weapon, which gives you lifesteal for a while. There's Rapid Cancel, which lets you just cancel out of any move you are locked into the animation of, and a whole bunch more I haven't even tried out. Then there's also Chain Cancelling, where you can switch to your second equipped job right after an ability quicker than it would normally allow you to do something else without chain cancelling. In effect, this means you can attack, ability, chain cancel, dodge, attack, ability, chain cancel, parry, soul shield parry, dodge, attack, ability, chain cancel, and just keep going like that without ever slowing down. As long as you don't die in combat, of course, the only real limiter here is your MP and break gauge to a lesser extent. You do have 2 break gauges, 1 per job, so you can take off the heat that way by switching between them, but as long as you have MP, you can keep spamming out abilities like there's no tomorrow. This makes the game even faster paced if you can master this, especially if both jobs complement each other well. Though in the end game it can result in chain cancelling from a job that can take a few hits into a job that gets one-shotted by the same enemy. as power level can get very disparate in the endgame, but even that can be mitigated with anima to level boost a lower level job and give it more survivability. What I'm trying to show you here is of course that the combat in this game is quite complex, very fast paced, and rewards skill very well, with most boss fights feeling extremely smooth once you know their moves. Most attacks have an optimal way of dealing with them, like flurries of physical attacks should be blocked, bigger obvious attacks should be soul shield parried, other attacks should be dodged. It is something that the game teaches you very well, with specific bosses like Merilith even getting a mention of using a normal block for attacks in the boss fight tips. I think Merilith is perhaps the best example of a boss that teaches you what attacks to dodge, parry and block. Aside from just the complexity in combat itself, the amount of customizability when it comes to playstyle is immense. Especially because advanced and expert jobs, which you unlock at the end of basic and advanced job trees respectively, allow for multiple weapons to be chosen per job. Jobs like Liberator even allow for literally every weapon to be used, or Samurai not just allowing katanas but also a gun, for example. Combo abilities are also specific to a weapon type, so if you unlock a combo ability for Red Mage, for the sword, you can still use that same combo ability even when playing Paladin, for example, which then also uses the sword, of course. So just the base game itself has an insane amount of stuff to try out. With a ton of jobs, a wide array of weapons, each job unlocking its own new combo abilities for those weapons, and each having their own command ability, it can be overwhelming. Then at the end of the main story, you unlock mastery points, which allow you even more customizability per job. The first DLC then adds a choice between 2 classes per job with their own tree to build out even more, with gear becoming even more powerful in the second DLC as well, allowing even crazier builds. There's a reason you can find an online spreadsheet that goes in depth to what stats do and the like, because there is just this much of a crazy amount to keep in mind when building out your character, which you can also do for your companions, by the way, albeit just limited to their equipment and limited choice of job. In combat itself then, there are a lot of attributes present here to spice things up and keep you on your toes. Enemies have their own strengths and weaknesses, like skeletons being weak against blunt damage, or elementals being immune to their corresponding elemental damage. Some enemies have physical weak spots, like an ogre having a huge scar on its back, a curl's whiskers, a griffin's wings, a chimera boss's heads. Hit these weak points enough with the right type of damage and you weaken an enemy substantially. The more basic enemies, like goblins or wolves, are no real threat on their own, but usually come in packs. Bats are annoying and fly around, throwing out AoE attacks. Elementals can cast spells and even buff other enemies. There's even more mini-boss tier enemies like those ogres or griffins that can do a lot of damage and aren't as easily staggered or killed as more basic enemies. The first time you come across these guys, they are alone. But eventually you'll find them mixed in with other enemy types, which makes prioritizing targets and being aware of your surroundings very important in combat. Obviously you have your ways of dealing with being overwhelmed by enemies. Soul bursts push them back, giving you a chance to breathe. Practically all weapons have AoE abilities available, and the Lightbringer makes it easier to keep enemies down in general. It's not always easy during combat to keep all of these unique aspects in mind, of course. Certainly not when a dark event is spewing out new enemies every so often, as you're still fighting a whole mob of them already. But it is very cool that detailed stuff like this is present here. This principle goes for all weaknesses and strengths in general in any game, really. It adds flavor, rewards you for exploiting these once you realize them, but aren't necessary to defeat these enemies. It just makes it easier if you do, or harder if you don't. There's even environmental interactions, like shooting down overhanging hazards, or electrocuting water, or exploding barrels, or just smashing enemies against the wall. So to recap, every weapon is unique, every job is unique. Every enemy type is unique, with their own stronger variants as well. Every piece of gear is unique, every build is unique, every boss is unique, even every attack is unique, with purple named attacks being usable by yourself after a soul shield parry as a limited use instant ability. This game just bursts at the seams with variety, that it's almost just easier to stick with something you enjoy at the start of the game and keep plugging away at that playstyle, instead of experimenting and trying out some new jobs here and there, even if that does come at the cost of playing essentially the same way for the entire game. The entirety of the combat system here is a lot to take in, of course, and some of the menus or even some of the terminology might be confusing here and there, but you can always look up stuff either in-game with the tips and tutorials menus or outside of the game with the big spreadsheet. Also, even if you see all of this and think the game might be too hard for you to get into, don't worry. That's what easy difficulty and extra mode are for. Extra mode is essentially just baby easy mode for the end game after completing the main story, where you get infinite MP and permanent Chaos Bringer, which you can build around to make yourself literally in. It's a built-in semi-god mode that's just an optional cheat if you want or need one, like beating a boss you're stuck on for 2 hours or wanting to get higher gear without wanting to grind out all the steps in between, I suppose. I never used it myself except the one time for the video, as the challenge is what I enjoy in games like this, but the option is there for those who want or need it. After finishing the main story, you unlock a new difficulty. Chaos difficulty. What playing on this difficulty does is it raises the base level of all missions, as well as the level of loot to find there and the strength of monsters present there. In essence, this is just New Game Plus. Go through the same main and side missions you've unlocked during your adventure to get ever better gear, with the added ability to raise the mission level even further with anima crystals. Chaos difficulty starts at about level 120-130, about where the main story ends, and goes up all the way to level 300 if I'm not mistaken, but realistically only until level 200, which is where the first DLC starts. Completing main missions in Chaos difficulty or higher also provides you with limit releases, raising the level cap on all of your jobs. This is how you get more and more mastery points and keep getting more powerful even after finishing your job tree. When the game first launched, I assume Chaos difficulty was essentially a playground type deal if you still want to try out some more jobs, enjoy the combat some more and stuff like that, with no real end goal in Chaos difficulty aside from some achievements and of course the masculine urge to see number go up and to min-max your builds with artifact gear and the like. With the DLC though, Chaos difficulty has essentially become an entirely optional segue to the first DLC. Optional in the sense that you get a level 200 gear set at the end of the story anyways, which allows you to hit the ground running with the first DLC, BAHAMUT. A high-powered DLC gear set, not exactly something I would recommend by default, and it was also something I actively avoided in Monster Hunter World. But in Stranger of Paradise, just equip it and go straight into Bahamut difficulty with it. You are just saving your own time doing this, as all the special rewards like limit releases get condensed anyways. Whether you clear a mission at Chaos difficulty level 140 or all the way at the end at level 500 doesn't matter, because you still get every limit release and piece of gear from every threshold in between. I mean, you can just grind up that way if you want to, but better to do that grinding in Bahamut difficulty, where you're getting dragon treasure and progressing the story anyways. There are 3 DLC for this game. On Steam you buy all 3 in the season pass for $15 base price, which is more than worth it if you're looking for the challenge these DLC provide. Each one of these DLC introduces a new difficulty, new story missions, and new mechanics. Except maybe the last one not really having a distinct mechanic for itself. Just content-wise, I would estimate all the DLC provides double the content of the base game at least. So if you liked the base game, do yourself a favor and play the real game after. Bahamut difficulty then is the first DLC you access, after defeating the Warrior of Light in this level 200 boss fight. After defeating this pushover and going to talk to Bahamut himself, you unlock the Trials of the Dragon King mechanic, which is something very similar to the Pact of Punishment system of Hades. It allows you to spice up your missions with debuffs to you and buffs to your enemies, in exchange for receiving dragon treasure you can then use to buy gear or items with. It's a cool system to add in some optional challenge, and it's also the only way to buy gear in the game in general, but some of these trials are especially brutal unless your build can handle them. Thankfully, you can of course just not activate those, but even then, just upping enemy stats or lowering your own break damage, there were times where I could just go through the mission without any real problems defeating enemies along the way, but then the boss of the mission would just be an unkillable one-shot machine I had no chance against. Whether this was due to my own build just not being good enough for this level of Dragon King trials, or whether this had something to do with enemy stats and boss power breaking the game, I'll leave up in the air because I just don't know for sure. But safe to say, the Dragon King trial stuff is at least an interesting way to make it harder for yourself as you grind out ever higher main story missions for those extra limit releases, Dragon Treasure and Rat Tails. These rat tails are essentially neutral skill points you can use to build out an entire new class tree, having your pick between an evocation or ultima class tree for every job in the game. These alter the job action, like for Berserk lowering the initial duration but allowing the effect to be replenished by hitting enemies, with the class tree then providing some very decent stat boosts on top of that. Additionally, gear in Bahamut difficulty and beyond can also have affixes that are only active if you have enough Ultima or Evocation job affinity, with the trade-off that these are more powerful affixes than regular ones. All in all, just this first DLC adds in a ton of new stuff to keep you busy, even if it is largely still the missions from the main story, which is why I would recommend going straight into Bahamut difficulty instead of lingering in Chaos difficulty, as you're essentially doing the same stuff anyways. There's also regular conversation with the Dragon God himself to keep it flowing on the story front as well. Eventually you prove to Bahamut you're strong enough for him to work with, by actually beating him, and he promises to help foster the Warriors of Light that appear every Chaos cycle. That is also the final boss of this DLC, a rematch against that pushover Warrior of Light at the start of the DLC, this time with a second phase where he is empowered by Bahamut, making him a lot harder to deal with. After completing this iteration of the Chaos cycle, with Jack still unsatisfied by Light's potential, the cycle goes ever on, until an interdimensional visitor stumbles into this world. Gilgamesh, the extremely powerful bumbling buffoon, manages to stumble into the Hall of the Dark Crystal, not by his own designs, however. After you give him a sizable beating, he comes to his senses and mentions that something, or someone, is meddling with the very fabric of time and dimensions. Only one name comes to mind here, of course: LUFENIA. There is no way to face them directly though, not yet anyways, so traveling through this dimensional rift labyrinth is the best way forward to find some answers. This labyrinth is the main addition of the Gilgamesh DLC. It is essentially an entire roguelite game mode edition, which stands separate from the rest of the game. You start in this main hall and can pick any rift to go through, which will take you to a part of a main mission map with randomly strewn about enemies and a unique objective. These objectives range from finding a gateway, to defeating a chaos-empowered monster, to defeating waves of enemies, to killing one or multiple bosses. You complete these rifts to earn rewards. Gil to buy consumables with, to make your run easier, summon stones to summon monsters in the main hall that give you passive buffs to make your run easier, and of course powerful new gear to make your run easier. Earn enough dimension points and you go up a floor, ever increasing the difficulty as well as the rewards you obtain here. Eventually, you start summoning a lot of monsters, who have their own little side quests and interactions which are nice, who then give you buffs to make the labyrinth easier for a short while, with some lasting passive effects as well, as long as they're summoned in the hall itself. The catch here, however, is that if you die in any of these rifts, you are booted back to the main hall and lose an amount of dimension points. Get those dimension points to 0 on a floor, and all of your consumables are gone, all your gil is gone, and all summoned monsters are removed, requiring you to start from scratch and summon those monsters again and progress through their quests again, even if it does go faster the second or third time around. Losing out on your progress like this hurts, but is preventable, as you can buy up to 3 Phoenix Down consumables, which let you resurrect during a rift, preventing a death, as well as a lot of healing and MP items you can consume to make life easier. Or you can also just not take too many risks and focus on completing an easy rift safely and quickly if you don't have a dimension point buffer to afford to lose here. The main reward from going through these rifts, aside from the funny monsters and all that, is unidentified gear. These are rare, special pieces of gear you have to identify at the Tonberry blacksmith and reveal themselves to be relics, blessed with the power from a variety of summons or primals or eidolons or whatever, and these blessings both improve your stats as well as give you a special effect depending on which blessing you select as your primary. Shiva allows critical hits to build up the slow debuff on enemies, Odin allows damage to build up a physical vulnerability, Bahamut allows soul shields to stack up stat increases, powerful abilities like those ones. These relic pieces of gear are very powerful and become outright necessary to obtain to go through the upper levels of the endgame, but you might think to yourself, do I really have to rely on RNG to get a relic dropped in the first place, for it to have the right blessing with a high blessing percentage, and then get good affinities and good affixes all at once? No. Thankfully, this isn't the case, as another mechanic unlocked in Gilgamesh difficulty is the fusing of gear. There's also a little bit of a trade-off here, by the way, with missions outside of the labyrinth on Gilgamesh difficulty not providing this unidentified gear, but being the only real source of anima crystals and rat tails, which can't really be earned in the labyrinth itself. Labyrinth does provide a lot of job crests in return though, so it's a little bit of a balancing act, as anima crystals and rat tails are, just like job crests, usually needed for gear fusing in a lot of cases. Fusing gear essentially allows you to copy affixes and affinities from one piece of gear onto another, though it means destroying the one you copy from. In practice, this means finding a good relic base with the right blessing you're looking for and a high blessing percentage, and then grafting other affixes onto it. This of course means sifting through the insane amount of gear you obtain and pick out the ones with the good affixes, like all damage taken minus 12% at Ultima rank 10 or whatever, or build enhancing ones like buffing Berserk for 30%, stuff like that. You can then graft those affixes onto that relic base and create insanely powerful gear pieces that way. It again almost reminds me of Path of Exile in a sense, the way you can craft gear like this. One very annoying thing with fusing though is that you have to be in the labyrinth main hall and speak with the Tonberry smith to be able to fuse gear. It's not something you can just do from the main menu smithy, which becomes annoying when you're not in the labyrinth all the time anymore. Like if you want to get all the limit releases you missed outside of the labyrinth or go into LUFENIA difficulty. It can even be misleading as you have affinity related buffs inside the labyrinth, so a 600% affinity total inside the labyrinth might not mean the same outside of it. Though the real endgame is inside the labyrinth, so it's not that big of a deal. After going through this labyrinth and reaching floor 21, where you then have to defeat the null void boss, the Death Machine, the story part of Gilgamesh difficulty concludes. You can still go deeper into the labyrinth, with gear quality and enemy difficulty increasing as you reach higher and higher floors. Gilgamesh himself also starts offering you challenge rifts that rewards you with a special accessory that give you a 400% affinity trait and can even give you a primary blessing as an affix, which is amazing, as you can also fuse accessories. This does mean you can have multiple primary blessings active at the same time, though getting to that point requires hitting Labyrinth floor 101 at the least from what I've read online. I think Gilgamesh difficulty as a whole is the most interesting part of the entire game, as it provides the most gameplay variety by a mile. The remixing of enemy placements in the established maps is something I kind of expected to be present in either Chaos or Bahamut difficulty, but whether you play a main story mission at level 10, 200 or 500 doesn't matter, the level is exactly the same each time, with maybe 1 or 2 monsters being Chaos empowered here and there. So the rifts in the labyrinth, plopping you down in a random spot on a map, with random enemies around and a unique goal to achieve is great, and is also what keeps this DLC so fresh. It also starts incorporating the Dragon King trials of Bahamut difficulty, with higher floor rifts having some rifts that have trials applied. And you can also start getting void treasures for completing regular missions with at least rank 7 Dragon King trials as well in Gilgamesh difficulty, which then allow you to buy relics from the Dragon King shop. Once you go through LUFENIA difficulty, the mannequin enemies and materials get retroactively added to the labyrinth as well. So again, the true endgame is really just climbing the labyrinth, which again is kept fresh by the random nature of the rifts. It's peak. So after finishing Gilgamesh difficulty, the final DLC opens up with the final difficulty being called LUFENIA difficulty. This one is special in that it removes the mission levels altogether, with everything being balanced to a base level of Labyrinth floor 30 in terms of power, which you can raise yourself as a newly added Dragon King trial if you want that added challenge. Aside from the added story missions here, which serve as the final conclusion of the story as a whole, LUFENIA difficulty also adds some cool quality of life features. You start earning mannequin materials from missions in general, which serve as a universal crafting resource to substitute anything you might be missing for advanced gear crafting and fusing, which is very neat. Substituting 20 rat tails or 200 Dark Knight crests will still take an amount of grinding though, of course. You can also start duplicating gear after completing the first LUFENIA story mission, which means if you find a piece of gear with very good affixes you want on multiple of your other pieces, you can just do that through replication instead of needing to choose on which piece of gear you want that affix, which is very nice. Aside from all of that, the labyrinth floor limit of 100 in Gilgamesh difficulty is removed and you can keep going ever higher, which according to these definitely not cheated labyrinth records means you can reach up to floor 99,999. Let's go get it, gamers! There are also some new bosses added to the pool here, of course, but LUFENIA difficulty is essentially just the Go Wild Bro capstone DLC that gives you some insane challenges if you want those, as well as the possibility of building up insane power needed to complete those challenges. Even after defeating the last 2 final bosses in LUFENIA difficulty, after which you get a neat little ending cutscene, there's still some DLC side mission boss rushes that include the final 2 bosses to defeat, on top of a few others, all in a row with no breaks in between. Good luck defeating that with maxed out Dragon King trials, bro. You even get an extremely hard mission as a reward for beating the whole game, which really tells you all you need to know. In conclusion then, Stranger of Paradise is a game that comes out swinging and never ever fucking stops. It has surprised and impressed me on so many levels I didn't expect. The combat is fun and intricate, the build min-maxing goes insanely hard, the enemy variety is nice, the boss variety is even better. The game provides a real challenge if you're looking for that, but can also be quite forgiving if you want it to be, thanks to extra mode. The story goes into some very cool and meta directions I didn't expect, the soundtrack is peak, soul burst animations are peak, the labyrinth is peak, It's all quite peak overall, isn't it? And so it surprises me it seemingly wasn't nominated for any real game awards in 2022 when the game first came out, which feels like a genuine shame. With a combat and build system this expansive and this many ways to play and customize your own experience, even at the base game level, I would expect at least a nomination for something like Best Action Game at the Game Awards. But in any case, if you should start playing Stranger of Paradise after this video, do keep in mind that the game may feel overwhelming here and there, especially at the start, or even frustrating at the start, as you get used to how the combat and the game itself feels to play. But once you get more intimate with its systems and get a knack for the combat and it all starts clicking together, this game, especially once you get into the DLC, is quite a fun, challenging and fulfilling action-packed game that I genuinely loved playing. After being so impressed with Monster Hunter World last year, and now this, I guess I'll have to dive more into Japanese action games, huh? Probably starting with one of the Neo games soon. So do I recommend Stranger of Paradise? Of course, in case this wasn't clear already. I think this is one of those rare games I feel is totally worth it, even at full price, with the full price being just $40 for the base game on Steam anyways, and another $15 for the DLC. So not even $60 for a game that I spent more than 80 hours on so far, which is definitely worth it in my opinion, just on that fact alone. So that's it for me, thanks for watching the video, I hope you liked it, and I'll hope to see you again in the next one. Peace out.